In January 2020, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Colorado Springs, Colorado became the center of a heartbreaking mystery that would soon capture the attention of the entire United States. The case began with the sudden disappearance of an 11-year-old boy named Gannon Stauch. At first, the situation appeared to be a missing child investigation. But as days passed and investigators began uncovering strange details, the case slowly transformed into something far darker. And at the center of the mystery was someone who had been responsible for caring for Gannon. His stepmother, Letecia Stauch. Gannon Stauch lived with his father, his younger sister, and his stepmother in a residential area of Colorado Springs. Friends and relatives described Gannon as a cheerful and intelligent boy who loved video games, school, and spending time with his family. He was known for having a kind personality and a bright smile. His father worked long hours to support the family, while Letecia Stauch was responsible for helping take care of the children at home. To neighbors and teachers, the family appeared normal. No one could have imagined that their home would soon become the center of a national investigation. The events that triggered the mystery began on January 27, 2020. That afternoon, Letecia Stauch contacted authorities and reported that Gannon was missing. According to her story, Gannon had left the house earlier in the day to visit a friend. But when he failed to return home, she became worried. Soon after the report was made, police officers arrived at the Stauch home to begin searching for the missing boy. At first, investigators treated the situation as a possible runaway or missing child case. Search teams began combing through nearby neighborhoods, parks, and wooded areas. Police officers knocked on doors, asking residents if they had seen Gannon. Volunteers from the community also joined the search effort. Local news stations began reporting the disappearance, hoping someone might have information about the boy's whereabouts. For Gannon's father, the situation was devastating. At the time of the disappearance, he had been out of town for work. When he learned that his son was missing, he rushed back to Colorado as quickly as possible. He joined the search efforts and made emotional appeals to the public, asking anyone with information to contact authorities. The community responded with an outpouring of support. Hundreds of volunteers joined search parties. Flyers with Gannon's photograph were posted throughout the city. Social media quickly spread the story across the country. But as investigators continued examining the details of the case, something about the timeline began to feel strange. Police soon noticed that the story provided by Letecia Stauch did not fully match the evidence they were discovering. For example, investigators began reviewing surveillance footage from the neighborhood. Some of the recordings showed movements around the Stauch home that did not align perfectly with Letecia's explanation of what had happened that day. At the same time, detectives also noticed that Letecia's statements about the events leading up to Gannon's disappearance began changing. In one version of the story, she said Gannon had left the house voluntarily to visit a friend. In another version, she suggested that someone might have taken him. Later, she hinted that Gannon may have run away on his own. Each time investigators spoke with her, the details seemed to shift slightly. To detectives, these inconsistencies raised serious concerns. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for physical evidence connected to Gannon's disappearance. They examined the house carefully. They analyzed electronic devices. They reviewed phone records and vehicle movements. Slowly, the investigation began uncovering troubling clues. One of the most significant discoveries involved surveillance video from the Stauch neighborhood. The footage appeared to show Letecia leaving the house with Gannon earlier in the day. But what investigators found more concerning was what happened later. When the vehicle returned to the house, Gannon did not appear to be with her. This discovery raised a disturbing question. If Gannon had left the house with his stepmother earlier that day, why did she return alone? Detectives continued digging deeper into the timeline. They also began reviewing internet searches and text messages connected to Letecia. Some of those digital records suggested she had been researching unusual topics shortly before Gannon disappeared. Investigators also examined the family's vehicle for potential evidence. Inside the car, forensic experts discovered traces that raised further suspicion. As these clues began accumulating, the focus of the investigation slowly shifted. At first, police had treated Letecia Stauch as a concerned family member. But now, investigators began viewing her as a possible suspect. Meanwhile, the search for Gannon continued. Days turned into weeks, and the missing boy had still not been found. The longer the search continued, the more painful the situation became for Gannon's family and the community supporting them. Then, in February 2020, the case took a dramatic turn. Authorities announced that they were no longer treating the situation as simply a missing child investigation. Instead, they now believed that Gannon Stauch had likely been the victim of a crime. The announcement shocked the community. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing boy had now become a homicide investigation. Shortly afterward, detectives made a major decision. Based on the growing evidence, they moved forward with charges against the person who had been with Gannon on the day he disappeared. His stepmother. When police arrested Letecia Stauch, the case instantly became national news. Many people struggled to understand how someone responsible for caring for a child could be involved in such a tragedy. But investigators believed the evidence pointed directly toward her. Still, one heartbreaking question remained unanswered. Where was Gannon Stauch? The search for the missing boy continued as detectives worked to uncover the full truth behind his disappearance. And the investigation that followed would reveal disturbing details about what may have happened inside the Stauch home on the day Gannon vanished. After authorities announced that the disappearance of Gannon Stauch was now being treated as a homicide investigation, the case quickly gained national attention. The quiet neighborhood in Colorado Springs had become the center of one of the most disturbing missing child cases in the country. At the same time, investigators were beginning to focus more closely on the person who had been responsible for caring for Gannon on the day he disappeared. His stepmother, Letecia Stauch. In the early days of the investigation, Letecia had spoken to reporters and appeared on local news broadcasts. During those interviews, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Gannon's disappearance. She claimed she loved the boy and had been helping police search for him. But as the investigation continued, detectives began discovering evidence that contradicted several parts of her story. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from surveillance cameras in the neighborhood. Investigators reviewed video recordings from nearby homes and security systems. The footage showed Letecia's vehicle leaving the house on the morning Gannon disappeared. The video also appeared to show Gannon entering the vehicle. But when the vehicle later returned to the house, the boy was no longer visible. This discovery raised serious concerns for investigators. If Gannon had left the house with his stepmother, what had happened between the time they left and when she returned home alone? Detectives also began examining Letecia's phone records. Those records revealed movements and communications that did not match the timeline she had given to police. Investigators also noticed that Letecia's explanation of the events changed multiple times. In one version of the story, she claimed Gannon had left the house on his own. In another version, she suggested that he had gone to a friend's home. Later, she hinted that someone might have kidnapped him. Each new explanation seemed to conflict with the previous one. Meanwhile, forensic investigators were examining the Stauch home for physical evidence. Inside Gannon's bedroom and other areas of the house, they discovered traces that raised even more suspicion. Some evidence suggested that a violent event may have occurred inside the home. Although investigators did not release all the details publicly at the time, the discovery strengthened their belief that Gannon had been harmed. As the evidence continued to grow, authorities made the decision to arrest Letecia Stauch in early March 2020. She was taken into custody in South Carolina, where she had traveled shortly after Gannon's disappearance. Her arrest shocked many people who had followed the case. Just weeks earlier, she had been appearing on television interviews claiming she wanted to help find the missing boy. Now she was facing serious criminal charges. Prosecutors charged Letecia with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, and tampering with evidence. According to investigators, they believed Gannon had been killed inside the family home. But even after the arrest, one heartbreaking question remained unanswered. Gannon's body had still not been found. For his father and the rest of the family, the uncertainty was devastating. They continued hoping that investigators would eventually locate Gannon and uncover the full truth about what had happened. Meanwhile, detectives continued searching for clues that might lead them to the missing boy. The investigation soon expanded beyond Colorado. Authorities began tracking Letecia's movements in the days following Gannon's disappearance. Phone records and travel data revealed that she had taken a long trip across several states. Investigators believed this trip could be connected to the disposal of evidence. As they continued following the trail, the search eventually led them hundreds of miles away from Colorado. Then, in March 2020, the case reached another tragic turning point. Authorities discovered human remains in a remote area of Florida. After forensic testing, investigators confirmed the heartbreaking truth. The remains belonged to Gannon Stauch. The discovery ended weeks of searching and confirmed investigators' worst fears. The missing child they had been trying to find was gone. For Gannon's family and the community that had supported them, the news was devastating. But the investigation was not over. The discovery of Gannon's remains allowed prosecutors to move forward with a stronger case against Letecia Stauch. Now, the focus would shift to the courtroom, where prosecutors would attempt to prove that she was responsible for the death of the 11-year-old boy. And as the legal battle began, even more disturbing details about the events inside the Stauch home would soon come to light. After the discovery of the remains of Gannon Stauch in Florida, the investigation into the case entered a new and heartbreaking phase. For weeks, authorities had searched desperately for the missing boy. Now, the worst possible outcome had been confirmed. Gannon was no longer missing. He had been killed. The discovery of his body provided investigators with crucial forensic evidence that would later play an important role in the prosecution of Letecia Stauch. According to investigators, the remains were found in a remote area in Escambia County, Florida, hundreds of miles away from Gannon's home in Colorado. The distance alone raised serious questions. How had the body of a child from Colorado ended up in Florida? Detectives began examining Letecia Stauch's movements in the days after Gannon disappeared. Phone records, surveillance cameras, and travel records helped investigators reconstruct the timeline. According to prosecutors, Letecia had taken a long road trip shortly after Gannon vanished. During this trip, she traveled through several states, eventually reaching Florida. Investigators believed this trip was directly connected to the disposal of Gannon's body. But the evidence revealed something even more disturbing. Forensic analysis suggested that Gannon had been the victim of an extremely violent attack. Although many of the details were difficult to hear, prosecutors later described multiple injuries that had been inflicted on the child. The brutality of the crime shocked even experienced investigators. The evidence suggested that the attack had likely occurred inside the Stauch home in Colorado Springs. Detectives returned to the house and carefully re-examined the property. Using advanced forensic techniques, they discovered additional traces of blood and other evidence that had previously been hidden. Some of the evidence appeared to have been cleaned. But even after attempts to remove it, investigators were still able to detect traces that supported their theory. Prosecutors believed that after the attack occurred, Letecia had attempted to hide the evidence and remove Gannon's body from the home. Investigators also examined digital evidence connected to the case. Phone data revealed that Letecia had conducted internet searches related to suspicious topics shortly before and after Gannon's disappearance. These searches included questions about travel routes and other details that prosecutors believed were connected to the crime. Meanwhile, the legal process began moving forward. Letecia Stauch was extradited back to Colorado to face the charges against her. During early court hearings, prosecutors began presenting the evidence they had gathered. They described the forensic findings from the house. They explained the travel timeline that placed Letecia in Florida shortly before the discovery of Gannon's remains. And they revealed additional information about her behavior in the days after the boy disappeared. One of the most troubling pieces of evidence involved Letecia's changing stories. According to investigators, she had given multiple explanations about what happened to Gannon. In some versions of the story, she suggested that he had been kidnapped. In others, she claimed he had run away. At one point, she even suggested that someone else had broken into the home. But none of those explanations matched the physical evidence collected by investigators. Prosecutors argued that the changing stories showed an attempt to mislead authorities. Meanwhile, Letecia's defense attorneys began preparing their strategy. They announced that they planned to argue that Letecia had been suffering from severe mental health problems at the time of the crime. The defense suggested that she may not have been fully aware of her actions. This argument would later become a major part of the trial. As the legal proceedings continued, the case attracted national attention. News outlets across the country reported on the disturbing details of the investigation. The story of a missing child, a cross-country journey, and the discovery of remains hundreds of miles away captured the public's attention. For Gannon's family, however, the attention brought little comfort. They continued mourning the loss of the young boy whose life had been taken so tragically. Gannon's father spoke publicly about his son, describing him as a kind and loving child who had bright dreams for the future. Friends and relatives shared stories about Gannon's personality, remembering his sense of humor and the joy he brought to the people around him. But the search for justice was far from over. The final chapter of the case would unfold in a courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would present their arguments before a jury. And the verdict in that trial would determine whether Letecia Stauch would spend the rest of her life in prison for the death of the 11-year-old boy she had once been trusted to protect. As the trial of Letecia Stauch finally began in early 2023, the courtroom in Colorado quickly filled with reporters, investigators, and members of the public who had followed the heartbreaking story for more than 3 years. For the family of Gannon Stauch, the trial represented the moment they had been waiting for since the day the young boy disappeared. They hoped the legal process would finally reveal the full truth about what had happened inside their home in January 2020. The prosecution began the trial by carefully presenting the timeline of events that investigators had reconstructed during the investigation. According to prosecutors, the tragedy began inside the Stauch family home on January 27, 2020. On that day, Letecia Stauch had been alone in the house with Gannon while the rest of the family was away. Prosecutors told the jury that during this time, Gannon suffered a violent attack inside the home. Although many of the details were difficult to hear, investigators described the injuries that had been discovered during the forensic examination of Gannon's remains. The evidence suggested that the child had suffered multiple forms of violence before his death. Investigators also described how the attack had likely taken place inside the boy's bedroom. During the search of the home, forensic specialists had discovered blood evidence in several areas of the house. Some of the blood had been partially cleaned. But modern forensic technology allowed investigators to detect traces that were invisible to the naked eye. These traces helped prosecutors demonstrate that a violent event had occurred inside the home. Prosecutors then explained what they believed happened after the attack. According to their theory, Letecia attempted to hide the crime. They told the jury that she removed Gannon's body from the house and later transported it across several states. Evidence from phone records and surveillance cameras helped investigators track her movements during the days after Gannon disappeared. These records showed that Letecia had traveled hundreds of miles away from Colorado. Her journey eventually led to Florida, where Gannon's remains were later discovered. Prosecutors argued that the long trip had been part of an effort to dispose of the body and prevent investigators from finding evidence. But the prosecution's case did not rely only on physical evidence. They also presented digital records that investigators had collected during the investigation. These records included internet searches, text messages, and phone activity. According to prosecutors, some of the searches conducted on Letecia's devices suggested she had been researching information that could help conceal a crime. Although the exact meaning of the searches was debated in court, prosecutors argued that the digital evidence supported their theory of deliberate actions. Another major part of the trial involved Letecia's behavior during the investigation. Prosecutors showed the jury several interviews in which Letecia had spoken with investigators and media outlets. During these interviews, her story about what happened to Gannon changed multiple times. In one version, she said he had gone to a friend's house. In another version, she suggested he had been kidnapped. Later, she claimed that someone had broken into the house and taken him. Prosecutors argued that these changing explanations showed that she had been attempting to mislead investigators. But the defense team presented a very different explanation for Letecia's actions. Her attorneys argued that she had been suffering from severe psychological problems at the time of the incident. They introduced an insanity defense. According to the defense, Letecia may have been experiencing a serious mental health crisis that prevented her from understanding her actions. During the trial, mental health experts testified about her psychological condition. Some experts suggested that she may have been experiencing dissociation or other serious mental disorders. However, prosecutors challenged these claims. They argued that the evidence showed Letecia had taken deliberate steps to hide what had happened. The long trip across multiple states. The attempts to clean the crime scene. The changing stories given to investigators. According to prosecutors, these actions demonstrated planning and awareness. For the jury, the decision became a question of responsibility. Had Letecia been mentally incapable of understanding her actions? Or had she deliberately committed the crime and attempted to escape responsibility? After weeks of testimony, the trial finally reached its conclusion. The jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. For Gannon's family, the waiting period was emotionally overwhelming. They had spent years searching for answers about the loss of a child who had brought joy to their lives. Finally, the jury returned with a verdict. Letecia Stauch was found guilty on multiple counts, including first-degree murder. The verdict confirmed what prosecutors had argued throughout the trial. The death of Gannon Stauch had not been an accident or the result of mental confusion. It had been a deliberate act of violence. Soon afterward, the judge delivered the sentence. Letecia Stauch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision brought a measure of justice for Gannon's family. But it could never undo the tragedy that had taken place. The case of Gannon Stauch would remain one of the most heartbreaking child murder cases in recent American history. A story that began with the disappearance of a young boy and ended with the revelation of a devastating crime inside the place where he should have been safest. His own home.